Hi, friends. This is John, and this is the Regenerative Agriculture Podcast, where we talk about agronomic sciences and cultural management practices that can regenerate soil health, plant health, and ultimately public health. My guest for this episode is a farmer that you may have heard of, but if not, you're about to hear from him now, Adam Chappell from down south in the United States. Adam, it's an honor to have you here. If you could kick us off, tell us a little bit about your farming operation and how your management has evolved over the last couple of decades.
Sure. Glad to be with you this morning, John. I farm with my brother, Seth. We farm about 7,500 acres in Cotton Plant, Arkansas. And if you're wondering where that is, it's halfway between Little Rock and Memphis. So in east central Arkansas. It's real easy to find on a map. Just follow 40 halfway and then go up about 5 miles and you'll find us. We farm corn, soybeans, rice, cotton, and some small grains in the winter, mostly wheat and oats. And we've recently integrated cattle in the last few years whenever we can. That's a kind of a situation dependent process. So it's not every year, but it's every year that we can. We started off farming with our dad in 2005, and he retired in 2014 after a series of unfortunate events on the farm. And we've had it full tilt from there and kind of got started on this regenerative path, not knowing anything about regenerative ag. I don't know if your listeners are familiar with my story, but if not, I'll just go ahead and tell it to them.
Yeah, please tell us from the beginning. We have many listeners from all over the world.
Yeah, so we started farming in 2005 with Dad. So, we got in on the tail end of Roundup's effectiveness and quickly figured out that Roundup was losing the fight to pigweed. So we started doing everything that we were supposed to, trying to reduce tillage. Of course, we weren't completely no-till then, and we're as close to completely no-till as we can get now. But we started reducing tillage and just overlapping residuals and mixing up modes of action and rotating, doing everything we were supposed to do, and we were losing that fight to pigweed. That weed was single-handedly putting us in the bankruptcy category. I mean, we were getting closer every year, just, refinancing and having to do things to fill up shortfalls because we were spending more than we were making trying to fight that weed, and we were losing. So summer of 2009, things were getting real serious, and we figured we either had to figure out a way to beat this thing without spending more money or throwing more money at it, or we might as well line up and sell because we weren't going to make it. So I got on YouTube and started digging around, and I'd been to all the meetings in Arkansas and the Mid-South, and all the answers were the same, more herbicide, more rotation, more tillage. Well, none of that stuff was working. So I started investigating organic farmers. There weren't any organic farmers in our area at that time. There's a few now. Most all of them I found relied heavily at that time on tillage. And I've got pictures, John. I'm telling you, every time we tilled the farm, 2 days later, it would be solid green with pigweeds. When the sun hits them right, you can see the pink cotyledons, and then, man, you got a carpet. It's just a fight we couldn't win with tillage. And I just happened to find a guy named Pumpkinhead 81 out of Pennsylvania. And this guy was planting organic pumpkins into a big old tall grass called cereal rye. And I had never seen anything like that in my life. The closest thing we'd ever gotten to that's double cropping soybeans into wheat straw, stripper wheat straw, which is really easy. What this guy was doing looked hard. But, when I watched his videos, I noticed that, he was planting pumpkins in June, and I don't know what kind of weed spectrum they got in Pennsylvania, but I know they got one. But he didn't have any. He just had this big, tall, beautiful grass. And he was rolling that down and then transplanting his pumpkins. And I noticed his equipment wasn't too fancy, so that was right up my alley because I couldn't afford to buy anything new. I figured, well, I can make the stuff I got work if this guy can. So that fall in 2009, we scraped up what money we could, which wasn't much, and bought 300 acres worth of cereal rye seed and planted that. And then we planted some soybeans and some cotton into it the following spring. And that was our first experience planting anything into a cover crop. We were scared of it and didn't let it get very big, probably, 12 to 16 inches, and panicked and killed it. But even at 12 to 16 inches, the herbicide required on that 300 acres was, maybe 50 or 60% of what it was everywhere else. And that was huge. I mean, that put those acres in a profitable category. And, we thought we had a plan to beat this thing, and just started going as hard as we could from then on. And cover crops is what has kept us in business and took us from the brink of bankruptcy to profitable enterprise now.
So bring us forward to today. What does your operation look like today? Are you still killing your cover crops with herbicides? Tell us a little bit about your crop rotation, your use of cover crops in your operation right at this moment.
Yeah, sure. So back then we were corn, cotton, or corn, beans, and we grew rice in our bottom ground, and we'd rotate beans in there every once in a while. So one thing that's really changed is our rotations. At this point, we'll rotate all 4 crops on the same acre, which we've never done before. And we let our cover crops get as big as we can now. We plant green in most all scenarios unless we just get pushed out. We got to do something. We try to get the stuff before it starts going super reproductive, because we don't want it transferring, all the energy it's stored from the roots to the reproductive and seeds and things. We want to save those for our crops. So we will kill if we get to that point. But right now it's all still herbicide termination. We've got a big flat roller. Down here we plant corn and stuff early enough that crimping's not really an effective tool for us. It's not, most of our covers don't get to a stage where they can be effectively killed by crimping. So we still rely on herbicides, but the amount of herbicide it takes to kill a cover crop is a fraction of what it was to hit all these weeds that we had made resistant to everything. So I'm fine with that, because it's not near the chemical load that it was, and it's a lot cheaper.
What happens when we develop herbicide-resistant rye?
Well, I don't know. I guess I'll crimp it. If I can't kill it, I'll let it go and I'll crimp it. But
That doesn't seem particularly like you, but just the way you said that, for some reason, that flashed into my mind.
right. I'm not too worried about that. We use a lot of different grass herbicides and things, and try to learn the lessons from the past. I try to mix that up and keep that rye or oats or whatever from seeing the same thing too often.
So you mentioned that you are planting green. How long after your crop starts growing are you spraying?
Normally, we're spraying right after planting. So our typical kill will be, just take soybeans, for instance. We'll plant the soybeans. If we do have any kind of pigweed emergence or anything, like if we had a thin spot in our cover crop, then we'll come back with a light rate of gramoxone and a pre-emerge. And if we get a good stand of hard growing beans, there's lots of times we can get by with just that for the year. Maybe another post application, but a lot of times if we get a good stand of beans and can shade the ground fast, then that initial application is pretty good.
You mentioned that you're not using completely no-till. What parts of your operation are you still using tillage on?
So really the only time we have to do any tillage is when we have a really wet fall. And down here that, in the last few years has happened quite a bit. The last 2 have been really good. We hadn't had to till anything the last 2 falls, but 19 and 20 were both terrible. So we had to fix a bunch of ruts. Even with our improved soil structure, we still had ruts that weren't going to rebound. We had to fix. And then the only other time that we do any tillage is if we need to do some land forming. We got to get it where the dirt pans can move stuff around. For irrigation and stuff, we're all for irrigation. So that's pretty important down here. We don't have a lot of sprinklers or anything like that. So we've got to get it where we can water down the road. So those are really the only 2 times we do any major tillage, and that's not very often. The only real tillage equipment that we pull every year, I don't know that it would be called tillage equipment, really. It's just a furrow cleaner. We just pull a little 4-inch plow and clean out our irrigation furrow just so we can get water to the bottom of the fields. We've developed infiltration rates now that we actually need a little disturbance to get water to the bottom of the field. If we don't clean that furrow out, we're only going to get about halfway down the paddock before we lose all our water. So we'll have, really good crop at the top and dry at the bottom because we can't get it to push out to the bottom. So,
Wow, now that's a testimonial if there ever was one. You have to compact the soil so you can get it to the far end of the field.
yeah.
As you've been on this journey now for the last decade, what are some of the highlights that stand out in your memory? What are some of the stories that really took the shift for you?
Just the fact that we're still farming is a big deal for me. I don't know how many of your listeners have ever stared a lawyer in the face and tried to figure out what your plan was if, if you didn't make it this year. But I've done that, and that's not fun. So just the fact that we're still here and that's not at the front of my mind anymore is a huge deal. But from that first planting into cover in 2010 to now, I said before, cover crops are the reason we're here. And we had several what would have been career-ending events, I guess you'd say, in that time frame. So 2011, we had a historic flood, and my brother and my dad, our dad, both lost their homes, and our farm was flooded around the edges pretty good for a good long while. So that was a tough year. 2012, we had a historic drought, and 2012 is when cover crops just really showed out. We were still not financially able to get every acre of the farm covered in the fall. We had about half the farm covered that year. Had a good stand of cover crop. And the fields that we had cover crop in 2012 made excellent crops. And then the ones that we didn't, where we were still in the same bare ground situation, it was minimum till, but it was still bare ground. We couldn't keep enough water on those crops, and they made 40% less. So we can't farm a single acre without these things. And we were already getting there. That just really solidified it. And from then on, we did everything we could to get cover in the ground, and did in fall of 12, had a good year in 13, did it again in 13, had a good year in 14, except for the fact that we had a elevator fold up on us and hit us for a bunch of money that we'll never see again. But our inputs were so low that year, we survived that also. But that was the event that scared Dad bad enough. He's old enough. He said, I'm done with this. This is getting too risky for me at my age. So that's when he sold out. Me and Seth bought him out, and we kept going. We're too dumb to be scared, so we just keep rolling.
You mentioned profitability and reduced inputs, and we haven't really dug into that at this point. So you've been on this pathway using cover crops, and you mentioned the reduced herbicide inputs, but how has the adoption of cover crops, the adoption of no-till, contributed to your improved profitability? You've described how you recovered your situation on your farm. What are all the factors that these tools contributed?
We started out just trying to fight pigweed, and the other benefits that we saw just came, like they do. We weren't expecting them. One of the very first things we saw besides the help with weed control was we didn't have to water as much. That cover crop insulating the ground from the extreme heat and raising our infiltration rates and stuff, we noticed that we weren't having to irrigate nearly as often as we were on our other fields, even fields that were just no-till, but they were exposed to the sun and the wind, and we were cutting our irrigations in half. We'd go from 5-day intervals on corn to 10 or 12-day intervals on corn, and now we're up to 14-day intervals on corn. It's crazy how much savings that is. I mean, water here is shallow, but we've got a lot of electric wells and a lot of diesel wells, and those things add up pretty fast when you're having to run them all the time. And then we started noticing, and this kind of happened since I started trying to figure out what was happening on the farm. I started going to, no-till on the plains, national no-till, going listening to podcasts like yours, and just trying to figure out what I was seeing. I've got a master's degree in entomology. I study a lot of ecology, so it's kind of easy for me to grasp the concepts that the speakers were throwing out. It just made sense to me, but we were seeing those things on the farm. So we started reducing P and K a little bit at a time. And, we hadn't put out any P and K since 16, and then I've got a professor I work with at Arkansas State. He's interested in nitrogen cycling, and we've reduced our nitrogen requirements on corn and rice and cotton based on, a lot of his work. We're probably 60% of where we were before, maybe 50%, and especially today with the price of fertilizer, those are huge numbers.
That's a big deal.
Yeah, it's a big deal right now. And then we started working with a group out of Australia, and we do sap sampling and things, and they help interpret that. So we try to make adjustments through the season and in preparation for the next season based on sap sampling. And that seems to have made a huge difference in what we are using and not using. And it's just ever evolving. So stuff's changing every year.
The sap analysis is so valuable because you can see what the soil is actually delivering or not delivering. You don't have to guess. The contributions of cover crops have been, for you, improved weed control and reduced herbicide costs, reduced water, and reduced fertilizer. You started talking a little bit about entomology and ecology. What shifts have you noticed in your insect populations and the overall soil ecology?
The insect deal has been really big. We grow cotton down here, and it's just a magnet for insect pests, or at least I thought it was. Just for an example, I gave a talk last year. It was about cotton, the way we're growing cotton. I compared our insect sprays to just the state average. Lygus is a big deal for cotton around here. A lot of people spray that bug 6, 7 times a year. We sprayed on average 1.5 times for the farm. So once in some fields, twice in a few others. So compared to 5 times for the state average. And then Heliothis, bollworms, and things like that, we try to grow non-BT cotton, if we can. Even with non-BT cotton, our worm sprays were less than the guys that had BT cotton. We sprayed maybe closer to 2 times, and I think the state average was 3 on a stacked gene cotton, and ours was nothing. So my consultant that I went to graduate school with, he's a fellow entomologist. He would send me pictures and stuff, of like ant colonies just hauling off bollworm eggs, things like that you're not going to see when you're bombing with insecticide all the time. So, we're getting a lot of help from the beneficial population out there that I guess a lot of our neighbors are not.
I want to dig a bit deeper into some of your cultural management with cotton and some other crops. But before we go there, I don't want to lose sight of the profitability conversation. In very broad numbers, how has your profitability shifted? You were at a very difficult place a decade ago. And obviously today you're making money. How does your profitability compare with other growers in the region?
It's hard to tell. A lot of guys have new equipment. Everything's shiny and new, and they look like they're doing really good. But when all my stuff was shiny and new, I was doing really bad. So I don't know. I could speak from my experience. I know that when I was trying to figure out how to get out of that hole, everybody kept telling me I need to make more yield. Okay. And here's how you do it. You put out blah, blah, blah. So I'd do all those things, and my yield would still be the same as it was just trend. Every once in a while, we'd hit a lick and have a really good year, but we didn't change anything. We put out what they told us, and it would work one year, and then the next year we put out the same stuff that they told us, and it wouldn't work. It'd be, the same or maybe even less. I remember that 2009 year was a wet year. We did all the things, put out all the extra stuff they told us, and our yields were worse than normal because of the weather. Well, I figured out real quick, you can't control that stuff. I mean, you're going to get what Mother Nature decides to give you. It's just that simple. You don't need all that stuff to get what she's willing to give you, I guess is what I've learned. Our profitability has come from cutting inputs, not raising yields. Our yields are still on par with all of our neighbors. I mean, because we rent 95% of our ground. We don't own a whole lot of ground. If we weren't competitive, we wouldn't have a farm. Landowners want return on their investment too, which is their land. And if there's somebody that can give them 20% more consistently, then that's what they're going to do. I understand that. So cutting inputs hadn't reduced my competitiveness as far as yield, but it has increased my margin by cutting inputs.
What you're describing is, yes, you have cut some inputs in the sense of pesticides and herbicides, but then maybe we need to think about this more in terms of input efficiency, and that some inputs are just a whole lot more efficient than others. For example, rye or oat seed is a whole lot more efficient at delivering P and K and some nitrogen than buying fertilizer. And so we tend to not think of those things as being equivalent, but in reality, that's actually what's happening and going on.
And I've heard y'all talk about this on this podcast, and lots of podcasts talk about this, soil sampling. And I've questioned my experts directly on this, but they keep telling me I'm going to mine my soil. I hear that every year. Well, if you don't put out something, eventually you're going to mine it all out. So I pull soil samples every year it was to ease my mind, but now it's to combat that narrative. So, we'll pull samples in the spring and I'll have 120 units of available K. All right. Well, soybeans is one that they say is the worst. So I'll plant soybeans on that and I'll make a good yield. And then I'll pull soil samples again in the fall and again in the spring. And I've still got 120 units of available K within that range of 10 or 20 units, whatever. They're still there. I didn't get it all, even though my removal rate said I should have. If I had 120 units available and I supposedly used 130 units on this crop, why do I still have 110 left in this fall soil sample?
And why can you repeat that every year for 20 years and still have the exact same numbers showing up?
Yeah, we've been doing it since 16, and I keep pulling the samples just to poke at my experts now. But I've never gotten a sufficient answer on that. So I just don't pay much attention to them anymore.
There's good reason not to. I think that the simplest way to summarize this is that soil tests can be, I'm not saying they always are, but they can be a very effective fertilizer sales tool. And that's how they're commonly used.
I'm in 100% agreement with that. I think most of the things that we see are sales tools.
Yeah. Let's get back to talking about some of your crop management practices and cultural management. I've made the comment on many occasions that we don't really know what healthy plants actually look like anymore. And I've been intrigued by how plants express themselves differently when we give them permission to do so, when we put them in an environment and give them the opportunity to really express themselves. I had a fascinating conversation a year or two ago with Dr. Norman Uphoff from Cornell University on the system of root intensification, where we talked about giving plants more spacing. And I know that this is something you've been playing with on your cotton crop. How have you changed your cotton seeding rate and population and spacing, and how has that affected yields and how the plants have developed?
Yeah, so I'm a big fan of Dr. Uphoff. I actually am doing that same, well, not the system that he describes, but the version that I can implement on my rice as well. And it's been a game changer. But when I started working with that Australian group, I didn't know anything about plant intensification or root intensification. I was just trying to cut inputs that I was confident in cutting, and fertilizer, herbicides, things that I'd picked up and seen on my own. Well, seed had never really crossed my mind. And these guys from Australia, the two in particular, Ben Smith and Martin Hockey, I don't know if you've talked to either of them, but those guys came and visited my farm when we first started working with them. And they were like, you're planting way too much cottonseed. And, I wanted to agree with them because cottonseed in Arkansas is expensive. That's a whole nother topic. The price of cottonseed in Arkansas for the same exact bag and lot number in Texas, it's half in Texas than it is in Arkansas.
Wow.
And we can do a whole nother podcast on that one. That's just some criminal activity in the ag world. But anyway, it's expensive in Arkansas. So I wanted to believe them that I was putting out too much seed. So after that visit with them, I planted a field of 76-inch cotton, which I'm normally on 38-inch. So I eliminated a row, and I took my seeding rate from about 40,000 to 20,000. I just basically just eliminated a row. And of course, according to them, that was still way too high, but I was first time nervous as a cat. Anyway, so I tried it, and I have never seen cotton plants like that. The best way to describe it, and how I've described it in talks in the past, is if you've ever been in a cotton field and you walk out to the turn row, if a seed or something had fallen off the planter or whatever, and you've got one plant out there by itself, it is a monster. And it'll have 10 or 12 positions on the first 5 fruiting positions, and then go to 8 and then go to 6, just huge amounts of bolls. And that thing is just gigantic. Well, that's what you're doing through the whole field. You're just making those plants through the whole field. It just makes sense after you see it, but it is scary to do because everything you've ever been told is not to do that.
Who were you told that by? The guys selling the seeds?
Oh yeah, seed guys, yeah. Actually, I know some seed guys who've done some studies. Of course, they'll never admit to it or say anything about it because they'll lose their job, but they're seeing the same things we are, but they'll never admit it.
So how did this change your population? What was your seeding rate before and after?
Yeah, so the first year I went from 40,000 to 20,000. So I cut it in half. So I went from $120 an acre in seed to 60. And like I said, all I did was eliminate one row. I kept my planter set up the same. I just didn't fill up every other box, basically. And now at this point, I'm planting between 13 and 15,000. So, and that's about as low as I'm comfortable going currently. Yeah, it may change in the future, but right now I'm still getting a little used to it. But with all of that, our yields haven't changed much. I mean, if any. I mean, that first year, the field I planted on 76, I planted June 1st, which for us is super late. Previous to that year, the best June cotton I'd ever made was 950 pounds, and that field picked almost 1,100 pounds. So that was pretty good confirmation that system was going to work.
And as you have reduced your population down to 13 to 15,000, have you also reduced your row spacing, or are you still at 76 inches?
No, I'm still at 76 inches. I've actually got everything involved with cotton. I've got a 4-row, 76-inch wide cotton planter now. We've got a 76-inch hooded sprayer for that. And then we've actually set our cotton picker up to only pick 76-inch cotton. So we're fully committed to that row spacing. And there's no reason for us not to be. The inputs are half or less, and we're making the same length. So there's no reason to plant 38-inch cotton for us anymore.
Yeah, if you maintain your yields and you reduce your seed costs, I mean, my goodness, you're talking about a third of the seed costs essentially.
And with that, our fertility rates have gone way down. The last 2 years, we've put 300 pounds of ammonium sulfate at planting, and that's it. And I'm not convinced that that's not too much in, because we're fighting with growth regulator all year to keep that plant under control. So I feel like I'm too high on that, but
Yeah, we have on the cotton crops that we have been managing with SAP analysis, we have lost track of the number of fields and acres, but it's a large number that we have gotten PGRs to zero. It's really interesting. It's managing cotton with these high applications of nitrogen and then high applications of PGRs is like trying to drive with one foot on the brake and the other on the accelerator. It makes no sense.
Yeah. It doesn't make sense when you just sit back and think about it. We used to put 120, 130 units on cotton and just have to pour the growth regulator to it. And, now we're at half of that and still having to fight it hard. So we definitely need to reduce some more.
And the other key aspect is that every time we put on a PGR application or put on a PICS application, we know that it essentially shuts down photosynthesis for about a 3 to a 5 day period. So that has a negative impact on yield overall. We're much better off not putting it on in the first place. So how has this management technique of the system of root intensification changed your management of rice? You mentioned that you're already also doing some things with rice. What does that look like?
We're going into our third year with this system. The first year, it was just throwing darts at a board. We were messing with seeding rates and things and row spacings. And anyway, we finally have settled on currently. Now, this is probably going to change again this year. If we can get in earlier, we're going to reduce our rate some more. But this year, on average, we planted 6 pounds of hybrid rice, and we're using a planter to singulate the rice seed. When we were talking about how to set this up, we were envisioning, Dr. Uphoff's work and how they singulate one rice seed per square foot in that system. Now, with our furrow irrigation, we can't make our row pattern be 12 inches like that, but we can get close. The closest we can get is 15 inches on top of our bed and then a 23-inch irrigation middle. Okay, so that's how our row pattern is. So on top of each 38-inch bed, we'll have 15-inch wide rice, and then we'll have a 23-inch irrigation furrow between that.
Would that be 315s?
No, it's 2 15s and then a 23-inch. So we equal 38 inches there. It's just 15, 23. And then instead of drilling rice with that, we're using a precision planter to put one seed every however many inches that is on that spacing. And it usually ends up around 3 or 4 inches between seed compared to what we normally plant hybrid rice at, 22 to 25 pounds. So we're at a quarter of the rate, basically.
Wow.
It looks really thin for a while. It'll make you nervous. But, man, by the end of the season, it's so thick and tillered out. It's just beautiful. And we had one of the best rice crops we've ever had this year with this system. So the yield isn't going to be an issue. Our biggest issue is trying to fight weeds early. One of the problems with some of our ricing areas is they're real heavy, wet soil. So we're very limited on the cover crop species that work. Annual rye works really good. And then we've got, we try to incorporate radish or some kind of other brassica in there as much as we can, but we hadn't found many legumes that do very well in that. Soybeans included, they just don't handle that heavy, wet soil. In the wintertime is the worst. So we're still struggling to get that good cover to help us early with weed control. But we do have enough that we're not spending more than we normally do on herbicides. It's just we're not able to cut them as much as we'd like in rice. We're still figuring that out.
Yeah, there's a couple of legumes that are not widely known that might be a fit in your system. One that comes to mind is Kira clover, but that's more for drought. There's another one. It escapes me right now. I'll have to let you know what it is, but it's a low-growing clover that does particularly well in exactly the soil conditions that you describe.
Well, that would be great because we're struggling to find options in that. Aside from annual rye is gangbusters, but when you're trying to get some diversity, that it gets tough.
Yeah, and I know you're only a couple of years into your experimentation with rye, but what have your historical yields been like in the area, and what are your yields like now? And I know you said they're similar, but I'd just like to offer some context for people who might have different environmental conditions.
When we were watering with paddies, cotton plant is a real mixed soil. The bottom ends of our fields will be good rice ground, hold water well, and the tops will be sand. We'll have a vein of sand running through those fields. So flood irrigation for us was very costly. It was hard to hold a flood. The furrow irrigation deal has really changed everything for us on rice. So when we were doing flood irrigated rice, we grow just conventional varieties mainly because we couldn't justify the cost of the hybrid because we couldn't get everything we needed out of it to pay for it. But we'd run 140 to 150 bushels of dry rice, which is not great. I mean, it's for us, it was just barely a break even. Really, the only reason we grew rice in that fashion and with that yield is because nothing else would grow on that acre, really. So, but when we changed to the furrow irrigation, we utilized the hybrids and we got those yields up to 165, 170 dry, which was profitable, but just barely. But now, since we've cut that seeding cost to a quarter, and with that, our fertility cost has gone down because our plants are just so much more efficient at using what we give them because the root masses are huge. I mean, never seen roots on rice like that because they're usually pruned off because of anaerobic conditions. But anyway, with this new system, we're running like this year, our average dry was like 182, which for us is crazy. We had a few fields go over 200 dry, which we have only done a few times in our career. So I'm hoping this isn't an off year. I'm hoping this is repeatable. So we'll see. But even if it's not, if I can maintain that 165 to 170 at these input levels, then that's great.
That is exciting. This is one of the aspects that Norman Uphoff talks about. I mean, they eventually changed the name to call it the system of root intensification to make it applicable to more crops other than just rice. Can you give us a frame of reference? How has root system expanded? Are they now twice the size of normal of what you saw historically? 5 times? What does it look like?
When we were planting with a drill on 7.5 or 10-inch spacings or whatever, we'd have roots that were, I don't know, 6, 7 inches long, just a little fibrous root system there. It just wasn't impressive at all. You could pull the rice out of the ground really easy. And this is a good example of the impact it made on somebody who hadn't seen roots like that before. So I had a farmer come visit this summer because he was really interested in what I was doing. I think he was just wanting to see how nuts I was. But he said, "How are you fertilizing this stuff?" And I said, "Well, this field in particular, we side dressed with a little 32% in calcium, and we just use a drop nozzle in the middle of the row." He said, "Those roots on top of those beds, how are they getting that fertilized out there in the middle?" Well, I reached down there and pulled a clump out, and it took some work, but I ripped roots up all the way across to the other bed, 38 inches away or whatever. So he said,
Wow.
"Oh, I get it. that's how they're getting that fertilizer." So, because he was wondering why I wasn't putting it right on top of the bed there between the 15s and instead of just down in the furrow. And so I just showed him why instead of trying to explain it to him. And he was floored.
So, with these changes in population density and spacing with your cotton and the rice, have you considered doing this with your other crops? How has your crop management changed on your wheat and your soybeans over the years?
I'm really intrigued by the relay cropping that Jason Malk and John Kutz and all those guys are doing. I really want to try some of that this year, and I want to do it on a 76-inch soybean. So I've got a plot this year that I planted oats behind my wide cotton rows, and I want to band out a little, strip where my cotton row was and plant soybeans there and try a relay, a 76-inch relay soybean. That's just going to be an experiment, but corn, we've started messing with population a lot on. Like under pivots where we have trouble keeping up with irrigation, sometimes we've dropped our seeding rate. We hadn't really changed our spacings, but I'd really like to change some spacings and get an understory of cover going and try to incorporate my grazing animals there earlier, things like that. I've got to figure out how to not only make that work, I got to figure out how to explain to my landowners what I'm doing and how it's going to affect them. So that's a balancing act I got to walk, but that's just part of it. Most of the things I've done early on, I just kind of did them and everything turned out all right. So none of them got on to me, but I try to explain to them before I do something crazy now that this is what I want to try and this is why I'm trying it. So they've been really receptive. The landowners that I have really like the fact that the changes that we're seeing in their soil, and they know that we're taking care of it. We're not just putting unnecessary inputs on it. They can see it, they can smell it, and they really like the differences that they've seen. So landowner relations has been really easy so far.
At the end of the day, the comment that you made earlier still holds true, which is that you are still economically competitive and you're still able to be profitable. And as long as that remains the case, then, or even as profitability improves, that just continues to put you in a better position.
That's been the key. They haven't taken any big hits, so so they trust me. Well, I mean, they trusted me before, but whenever you start bucking the conventional production systems the way we have, they tend to get a little nervous.
With all of the various changes and the incorporation of cover crops, you mentioned at the beginning that you've also started including some livestock as you are able. What does that look like for you?
That's an entertaining story. It was an educational adventure as well, but we started hearing about livestock integration at all these meetings. And, livestock down here is people just don't have it. I mean, you got to go over to the hills or in the river valleys, and there's some guys over there that do row crops and cattle, and then in the hills, it's all livestock. But in our part of the world, in the Delta, there's just not many folks doing both things. I started hearing about the soil health benefits of animal integration, how important it is or how important it can be. So we decided we wanted to try some, and we kind of had a plan. We planted some winter wheat the year before, and then behind the winter wheat, we planted a big cover crop mix. I don't know anything about cows other than they taste good. So that's pretty well my knowledge of cows and cattle and everything. So early on, I would have said that would have been a weakness, but I'm not sure it is. I think I've avoided a lot of unnecessary expense because I know nothing. So we planted this big cover crop blend, and we've got a cover crop seed business. So I had access to all kinds of stuff, and I just knew what those plants looked like. And I said, well, if I was a cow, that would look tasty. So I'm going to throw that in there. So that's how I came up with the mix we did. It was just a random assortment of everything. We planted this, and man, it grew like crazy. I mean, it got big and lush and green, and anyway, it was just really tall. So we had our food source on our field. We had 100 acres planted like this. We cut some paths in it, put our fence up. We were doing 3-acre paddocks to start with, whatever. Well, now we needed cows. So I got a buddy that, and his one of his relatives that they farm cattle up in the hills, and they have a sale barn up in the hills in Arkansas. So I called them for help to go get some cows, and they said, well, you just need to come to the sale barn and see how it works, and we'll figure it out. So I started going to the sale barn on Mondays. I was sitting in there watching this thing go down, and of course, the auctioneer's running 100 to nothing, and I can't understand what he's saying. So I'm just like, I don't have a clue what's going on. But I noticed every Monday there was a bunch of old guys sitting on the top of that barn, and man, they were buying and selling every day, or every time I was there. they were shakers and movers, I guess you'd say. So I went up there and asked to sit with them, told them what I was wanting to do, wanted to learn. Well, they were all too excited to have a newcomer young man wanting to buy some cows that didn't have any. So I started sitting with them and asking them questions. And anyway, that went on for a few Mondays, and finally got ready to buy some cows. Had my checkbook with me, and I told them, I said, today's the day. We're going to buy some cows today. And they were all excited. Oh, there's some good ones out here. We'll get you fixed up today. And anyway, I had in mind that I was wanting to buy some cheap cows, and I had a picture of what cheap was in my head. Well, lots started coming through the sale barn there, and it was a beautiful lot of cows out there. And this guy said, man, that right there is a good starter kit. You need to jump on those. Those are good, healthy. They were running, I don't know, $9.50 a head or something like that. And I thought, there's not any money left for me in that. And I just told him, I said, no, it's a little out of my price range. I can't get very many for that. He said, oh, we understand. You just getting started. We get it. We'll find you something. And so we sat up there for a while longer, and this other group came out looking a little rough. They were running about 700 a head or something like that. 725 was about where the bidding tabled out at. And they said, there's some good money left on those cows. You need to get on those. And I did a little quick math in my head, and I said, no, still not what I'm after. It's a little bit high yet. At this point, they're starting to get concerned because to them, those cows looked rough, Yeah, but I was just, I couldn't make any money on that. So I hung in there for a while longer. Well, getting down towards the end of the day there, a lot of cows came out, and I wish I had the video pulled out for you to see it, but these things were just skin and bones. I'm talking about barely walking, standing, just anyway. The bidding got down to $200 a head before anybody said anything, and I was the first one to say something. I raised my hand, and those guys looked at me like I'd lost my mind. They said, "Son, those things won't make it back to cotton plant. They're going to die before they get there." And I said, "But think if they do, what kind of money I can make if they do? I mean, they're going to eat, eat, eat." Anyway, a guy down in front of me bid me up to $250 just to see if I was serious. But anyway, we walked out of there with 42 head at $250 a head. Two of them did die on the way back to cotton plant, so I didn't get them all back home. I had two dead ones there when I got there, which was unfortunate, but that's just the way it goes. Anyway, we turned them out in that big tall cover crop, and they disappeared, and we didn't see them for 3 days. And I got nervous. I was really nervous because I didn't know if they'd busted the fence on the other side and were down in the bayou or what. But my brother, he's pretty sharp. He said, "Man, you know what we need? We need a drone. We need to go get a drone." I said, that is a good idea. He said, "I bet you we can see them if we get a drone." So we ran over to Walmart and got us a drone, about $120, something like just a toy that took pictures. So we brought it back to the field, and we took it up, and we got one picture out of that drone before a hawk came out of the sideline there and took it out. It just wasn't big enough to scare him off, I guess. He destroyed that thing. We found it. We kind of saw where it went down. We searched till we found it. We got one picture off of that drone, but we had our cows there. I mean, they were still there. When I tell that story to people wanting to get into it, I always tell them to buy a drone big enough to intimidate birds of prey, because mine didn't, and it got destroyed. Man, you talk about a learning curve for somebody who's never messed with cows before. It was a lot of fun. I figured out that sweet feed is just like a drug for cows. You can get them to do anything if you get a bucket of sweet feed and they know you got it. So we figured out how to move them pretty quick with that stuff.
So you started off, you told us this incredible story of starting off with these cheap cows. Now you have to tell us the conclusion. Did you end up selling them? What happened?
One buyer bought all of them, and we ended up we sold them for $1,100 a head, because by the time he got there, they were beautiful. They were all open when we got them. We put a bull on them, so about 70% of them were pregnant, and we actually had a few calves on the ground, so a couple of them had to be, pregnant when they got there. But yeah, we sold that lot for $1,100 a head.
And how long did you have them?
We got them in I guess that would have been late October, 1st of November. Well, maybe it was early October that first year. But anyway, we sold them out in March.
Wow. 6 months.
Not too bad, yeah.
That's an incredible story, Adam. I like that story because it's perhaps an extreme example, and yet not really. But it shows the opportunity that exists. I've had Joel Salton here on the podcast, and other people in other conversations as well have described the tremendous opportunity of just buying inexpensive cattle at the sale barn and selling them again at the sale barn after you graze them for 6 months or 4 months or whatever the case is. And if you do it right, there is a lot more money to be made there than growing almost any crop.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. Of course, I hadn't repeated that margin. I've repeated some pretty good margins, but nothing that extreme because I hadn't found cows that bad yet. Again, that was by far the worst set I've ever found. If I could do that every winter, I don't know that I wouldn't just plant cover crop and run cattle because per acre, that's a lot more profitable than row crop.
That's an incredible story, Adam. So when you think about all of the experiences that you've had and the things that you've learned over the last decade, what is something that you wish all other farmers knew?
I guess it's something that I wish I'd have known when I first started going is most of the information you get, it's disguised as information to help you, but it's information to sell you something. That's kind of a cynical way to look at the world, but to me, that's the facts. That's been my experience. We've had mergers and big companies packaged as helping the farmer because of increased research budgets and blah, blah, blah. Well, it's never been good for us. Seems like every time those guys get together like that, our prices end up going up.
Well, when you think about the price contrast between cottonseed in Arkansas and Texas, that's enough to raise some eyebrows. And there's 100 or 1,000 examples like that.
If you had to just put it in message form, just think about what everybody's telling you, kind of with a little bit of skepticism and think it through. If you see an advertisement for one soybean seed that's going to give you 10 bushels more per acre, and then you turn the page in the magazine and there's a competing brand that's going to give you 10 more bushels an acre than the one you just saw, you got to be smart enough to realize that's a bunch of bull. Just don't fall for that stuff. And it's with herbicides, it's with fertilizers, it's everything. Everything is targeted to sell you something. I wish I'd have known that because they just push that yield narrative. You got to get your yields up to make money because they're going to take everything they can. And the only way for you to make it is to increase yield. And the only way to increase yield is buy some more of this stuff. So,
when I think about the pathway that you've been on, Adam, and the way you describe your transition at the beginning of this conversation, what you have really done, what you're really describing is you are replacing inputs with management. In some cases, you're replacing some inputs with others, like you're replacing your fertilizer with cover crop seed to some degree. But many of the transitions that we're talking about are replacing certain inputs with a different management style. And to me, this seems like such an obvious shift. Like if you had that choice, of course you would do that. But it's uncomfortable for many of us because we have to begin adopting new ideas and new technologies and new practices that are unfamiliar, and change is uncomfortable.
and the change was uncomfortable for me also, but I had gotten to a point where if we didn't change, it was over anyway. So, you don't have to wait till you get in that position to do these things. And I would recommend not getting in that position to do these things. Don't change because you absolutely have to. You're pass or fail then. There's no wiggle room. If you're still got some equity and doing, making it, you can make these changes and still have a little room for error, which are going to come. I mean, that's going to happen. It's not all, successes. Well, I've had plenty of failures because of the financial situation I was in when I started. Those failures, the pressure of those was 10x what it should have been. If I'd have had some room to make a mistake without losing everything, then it wouldn't have been so hard just mentally, I guess. But
Adam, what is your vision for the future for your operation? How do you see your operation evolving and management practices evolving in the future?
our ultimate goal is to continue to downsize. So at the peak of our farming, we were at just a little over 10,000 acres. And that was another thing we did because we kept hearing, the only way farmers are going to make it anymore is to get bigger. Get bigger. You got to get bigger because your margins are so thin. You got to have more acres. Well, so we fell into that trap. And so we were a little over 10,000 at our peak, and now we're down to 7,500. And in the future, we want to be quite a bit smaller than that. Our goal is to get smaller and to do more things on those acres, like continue with the animal integration. And, my papa always said, you need to have a farm you can work, not one that'll work you. And I've had one that's been working me for a while. and I'm trying to get down to where I'm working it now. So, and we're actually getting to the point after all those things that have happened to us where we're filling those holes in, and we're getting to where we can do those things. We can cut acres loose and focus a little harder on the ones that we're keeping. That's our goal, is to get smaller.
I don't think I've ever heard anyone express that as a goal before. I mean, I've heard people talk about the desire to go in that direction, but not definitively saying we want to get smaller. Adam, I think that's quite exciting, actually.
So it is for me.
My observation has been that there is usually a correlation that as farm size goes down, profitability goes up when they are managed well. I'm talking about total dollar amount, not per acre, but total dollar amount.
I agree completely with that, because 19 was a year where we didn't get the whole farm planted. It rained so much that we had to prevent plant about half of our farm. And at that time, we were about 8,500 acres. So we've been scaling down every year a little bit. Man, the crops we made on the half the size of where we normally were so much better than normal, because we had time to really focus in on things that were happening. And I believe you are absolutely right. I believe total dollar amount, we could do that on half the acres that we've got now just by doing more things on those acres.
Yeah, I see that often enough. There's a lot of appeal in driving big equipment and being able to claim lots of acres and stuff. There's a strong ego boost there that drives a lot of people to their detriment. Adam, this has been a wonderful conversation. I've really enjoyed it. What final thoughts do you have to share with other growers?
I wish I had a catchy slogan for it, but it's just not buying into the fear of, you got to have more acres or more yield. It just don't buy into the fear. That's what I've come to realize. I don't listen to that stuff anymore, and I just ignore it, and things have gotten better. The less I listen to it, the better things get.
Adam, you hit the nail on the head with that slogan. I like it because you used the word fear. You identified it as fear. And we often don't want to acknowledge that what motivates us is based on fear, even though it really is. That's very powerful.
Yeah. Oh, it's definitely fear. I mean, it's how many times have you heard, if you don't put this much fertilizer out, your yields are going to tank? I mean, I've heard that so many times. I mean, I've heard it enough now that I'm numb to it, but it used to really scare me.
Wonderful. Well, thank you, Adam. I really enjoyed this conversation. Thank you for sharing your wisdom and knowledge. I'm sure many people will find it valuable, and I look forward to speaking with you again soon.
Sounds good.
The team at AEA and I are dedicated to bringing this show to you because we believe that knowledge and information is the foundation of successful regenerative systems. At AEA, we believe that growing better quality food and making more money from your crops is possible. And since 2006, we've worked with leading professional growers to help them do just that. At AEA, we don't guess, we test, we analyze, and we provide recommendations based on scientific data, knowledge, and experience. We've developed products that are uniquely positioned to help growers make more money with regenerative agriculture. If you are a professional grower who believes in testing instead of guessing, someone who believes in a better, more regenerative way to grow, visit advancingecoag.com and contact us to see if AEA is right for you. Thank you for listening, and we look forward to working with you.